Alright, let's build a chamber. Before we even start, there are a few fundamental things we need to understand. One of the most important is climate. And when I talk about climate, I really mean temperature and relative humidity. The ideal conditions for curing meat is a temperature between 12 degrees Celsius and 18 degrees Celsius and a relative humidity of 65% to 80%. In terms of temperature, we want to keep it below 18 Celsius because above that we start running the risk of microbes activating in the meat. This will cause the meat to go off or worse, severe ear illness for the person who ingests the meat. My personal preference is for the temperature to be around 16 degrees Celsius. For humidity, there are a few things that we need to look for. In order to cure the meat, we have to remove as much of the water from the meat as possible. It is in this water that the dangerous microbes proliferate, and that is why we want to take this water out. Salts assists us in achieving this, but in order to cure the meat gradually and developing the flavors, we want to do it as slowly as possible, within the temperature range that I've suggested. In order to do this, we need to have a relatively high humidity. So anything below 65%, and you'll have an issue of case hardening. This is where the outer layer of the meat dries out faster than the inside, creating a hard exterior. Anything above 80%, and you're going to have too much moisture, creating a mold problem. For me, the ideal relative humidity is 75%. I'm not going to get too much into the science here, so if you want to delve deeper into that, please check out the book Preserved Pigs, The Art of the Curesmith. The ideal conditions for curing meat is a cool, damp and dark space. In the old days, meat was always cured in caves, but later on people started curing in cellars, like the one in this picture. Obviously, if you have a cellar where your temperature is below 18 degrees Celsius and the relativity is between 65 and 80%, then you have the ideal place to cure meat. Unfortunately, the majority of us mere mortals don't have such ideal conditions, and as such we have to create artificial curing chambers. One of my first curing chambers was built from old cauldron panels. I had some space in my garage and decided to put in a decent sized curing chamber. As a result, I made more and more cured meats, and eventually I started selling them commercially. As my business grew, I had to expand my curing environment, and eventually I had a curing room that was over 25 square meters in size. In 2019, we moved to Poland and we now live in an apartment. Due to the lack of space, I've now been relegated to a curing chamber that has been converted from a single door fridge. But this is really ideal for most home conditions. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the options that are available to us. I'm going to start off with a wine fridge. A wine fridge is a really good option because you don't really have to tinker too much with the thermostat. They usually go up to about 21 degrees centigrade. So you can set the temperature at an ideal setting of about 16 degrees Celsius. And that just makes it a hell of a lot easier than having to mess with the thermostats, as I've said. They're actually quite a lot more expensive than normal fridges, so that you would just have to watch out for. And obviously you are still going to have to add some humidity because as the temperature drops from the refrigeration process, then obviously we're losing humidity. Next on our list is a drinks fridge. This is a commercial drinks fridge that I'm talking about. I would suggest that you do go for a double door drinks fridge if you've got the space, but they do come in a variety of sizes from single door, half size, right through to the bigger double door fridges. These are ideal, particularly the larger ones, because if you've got a lot of meat that you're curing or you're wanting to cure stuff like prosciutto, then obviously you've got the space to do so. The great thing about this as well is that it cools blowing cold air rather than working with a freezer plate, which I'll deal with a little bit later. And so they're frost free, so that's pretty good. Some of the commercial drinks fridges also have thermostat settings that go up to 16 degrees centigrade, so you won't have to tinker with the thermostats. But unfortunately, the majority of them do only go up to about 7 or 8 degrees centigrade. But don't worry too much about that. I'm going to show you how to deal with this later. You should really be able to pick up a decent double door drinks fridge for quite a lot less than a new wine fridge. So this is a good option. So the last option we're going to look at is your stock standard domestic refrigerator. This is probably the most popular option because it's a lot less expensive than the others. But there are certainly a few things that you need to consider when you're purchasing a second-hand one, or you're looking to convert an existing domestic refrigerator into a curing chamber. Some of the recommendations I'm going to make is to make sure that you try and get a single door full-length refrigerator. So basically one without any freezer compartment or attached freezer to it. If you're going to get one that has a freezer box on the top or at the bottom, you're basically going to waste a quarter of the space. Also try and avoid to get one of the older type fridges where the freezer box is inside the actual fridge, but I'll explain this a little bit later. If you do have the money, I suggest buying a new one. There are several reasons for doing this. One of the most important is obviously that it's new and you know that it hasn't had anything that could possibly contaminate your meat stored in it previously. The other reason is that all new fridges, or most of the new refrigerators, are frost-free. And basically what this means is it uses cold air rather than a freezer plate to cool down, or an evaporator plate. But I'm going to explain this to you a little bit later. As I've suggested to you, if it's at all possible, is to get a brand new fridge, or at least to find a newer model that uses a frost-free system. But if you can't do this and you've got an older fridge lying around, then that's also okay, we can deal with that. But the one thing that I just want to point out is that it will more than likely contain what we call an evaporator or freezer plate. I'm not a fridge technician, so I'm not even going to bore you with the technical stuff. But the gist of it is that the freezer plate or the evaporator plate is a panel that sits in the back wall of the fridge. When the compressor comes on, the evaporator cools down to almost freezing. And this is what actually cools the fridge down inside. The problem with a curing chamber is that we're going to be adding additional humidity. So there's going to be more moisture in the air. This moisture will condensate as the fridge cools down, and it literally sits on the back wall as that cools down and it starts to freeze. And obviously when the compressor turns off, the water starts to thaw, and that then runs down the back wall. And this obviously then creates more of a moisture problem, which number one increases the humidity again, but also creates excess water that you need to drain off. My personal curing chamber is made from an older fridge that has a fridge plate, so I'll be taking you through what I did to get mine to work 100%. As stated earlier, you should also avoid at all costs trying to get a fridge that contains the freezer box inside the actual fridge. You will typically find these in smaller fridges or older fridges from sort of the 80s and prior to that. You will immediately notice this when you open the fridge door and there's a secondary door or a box sitting in the front of that compartment. The reason why I'm saying you shouldn't get one of these is the freezer plate actually sits inside this box. And the problem here is that when you get condensation, instead of it running down the back wall, it's actually going to drip onto your meat, because your meat will be hanging underneath this box. Okay, so now that we've had a look at fridges, we are going to delve a little bit deeper into temperature. As we stated earlier, we need to try and get our temperature band between 10 degrees Celsius and 18 degrees Celsius. Obviously, for me, the perfect temperature would be around 16 degrees. And so obviously, if you do not have a wine fridge or a commercial fridge that you can set the thermostat up to 16 degrees Celsius, then we've got two options available to us. Basically, the first option would be to take your fridge to a refrigeration expert who can physically change the thermostat so that you can turn the setting or the dial up on your fridge to at least 16 degrees centigrade. This would be the preferred method because it avoids having excess cables, as I'm going to discuss with you a little bit later. And the second option would be then to try and do this manually. The best way to deal with this is to use something that is called a temperature switch or a temperature controller, which I will take you through shortly. Okay, so simply put, a temperature switch or controller is a device that is a probe that goes inside your fridge. The fridge is then plugged into the actual controller, which then in turn is plugged into the electrical wall socket. The idea is that the controller is a computer that works with reading the temperature inside the fridge through the probe. You can then set a high and a low temperature on the controller, which is ideal for our purposes. In my chamber, I have the low temperature set to 12 degrees Celsius and the high temperature set to 14.5 degrees Celsius. So the idea here is that when the temperature inside the fridge reaches 14.5 degrees Celsius, the compressor turns on and the fridge starts to cool. And then obviously as it goes down and it reaches 12 degrees, the compressor is then turned off. So it then starts incrementally increasing until it gets back to 14.5 and then it turns on again. And so the cycle continues. My average on my fridge is around 14 degrees. I know I did say 16, but that's the maximum that I would like to go to. I don't want to go over that. I've set it like that so that my average is around 14 degrees. It does creep up above that and goes all the way up to about 16 because obviously when it hits 14.5 degrees and the compressor kicks on, it'll increase slightly and then it'll start coming down again. So that's why I set it like that. So I use a CHT 2000 in my setup. Another popular option is the Inkbird ITC 308. And these are both readily available off websites like Amazon. As stated, I'm going to show you later on in the video how to set this all up. Okay, so it's time now to talk a little bit about humidity. And as we've mentioned before, the problem with fridges is that they contain cold, dry air. And the colder and drier the air is, obviously the less humidity you have. So this is especially so when the compressor of the fridge is on and it's reducing the internal temperature of the actual fridge. As explained earlier, we ideally want a humidity of between 65 and 80%. And I've said to you before as well is that my ideal humidity is at 75%. So obviously as the humidity goes down inside the fridge, we're going to have to add humidity. And the only way we can do this is by doing it artificially. I've seen many people mention on the internet and on videos that they basically add humidity by adding a bowl of water to the bottom of a fridge. But I've tried this and in all honesty, I've never managed to get that to increase the humidity to levels that I need. So for me, the best way to introduce humidity is by using a domestic humidifier as demonstrated in the picture. They're usually good to humidify a 25 square meter room. But there are a few things that we need to look out for when purchasing a humidifier like this. First up, you need to make sure that the humidifier uses ultrasonic technology. And basically what this does is there's a plate that vibrates at high speeds on the water, which creates very, very fine mist. And this is okay because what it does is it won't actually wet the meat. It'll increase the humidity in your fridge, but won't affect the actual integrity of the product that is hanging. We also need to make sure that it has a mechanical or an analog switch and not an electronic switch. The problem with an electronic switch is that you will be using a controller to control the humidity, and when the controller switches off the humidifier, it will not be able to turn on again. So only humidifiers that have an old analog or a mechanical switch will work. And then the third option is make sure that you get one with at least a 5-liter water tank. You don't want to have to top the water tank up every other day. Although in your chamber, if it is set up correctly, you should only have to top this up every 2 to 3 weeks. To ensure that you obtain the optimal humidity in your chamber, as I've mentioned earlier, you should install a humidity controller. The humidity controller works similarly to the temperature controller that I mentioned earlier. Again here I use an SHT 2000. But Inkbird also have a humidity controller called the IH200. The great thing about the SH2000 is that it's one device that controls both the temperature and the humidity. So you don't have additional cables running into your chamber. The humidity controllers also have a high and low humidity setting. In my chamber, my low humidity setting is 72% and the high humidity setting is 72.2%. When the humidity drops to 72%, the humidifier turns on automatically and when it reaches 72.2%, it turns off. I know that's a very narrow band between the low and the high, but I'll explain it later in my video. The average humidity I get with this setting in my chamber is about 75%, but again, I'll deal with that a little bit later so that you understand that properly. We now want to look at some additional equipment that you may need for your humidity chamber. As I've explained to you earlier, fridges that contain an evaporator plate or freezer plate will generate additional moisture. Because we've added additional moisture with the humidifier to the fridge, this additional water will condensate against the evaporation, and it'll increase the humidity even more. You also have to remember that when you add meat, the meat also contains moisture, so you've got a lot of humidity going into this small space. So you may find a situation where you have too much moisture and you actually have to remove some of that using a dehumidifier. Frost-free fridges shouldn't have this problem at all. My current chamber is an older fridge with an evaporator plate, but I have managed to set it up without the use of a dehumidifier. Earlier I told you that on my controller my low humidity is set to 72% and my high humidity is set to 72.2. With that very narrow band, I'm able to use the cool air generated when the compressor is running to ensure that my humidity never goes above 79%, averaging actually out at about 75%. And I will show you later how I've done this. I suggest that before you go out and buy a dehumidifier, just to test your setup first, you may find that you don't need a dehumidifier. Besides, it just adds additional clutter to the bottom of your chamber. If you have to buy a dehumidifier, you need to do your homework, because I've tried to assist people in the past who have dehumidifiers that actually blow air as well as heat up. The excess airflow could cause your meat to dry out quicker, and obviously with the hot air coming out of it, if the device heats up, it'll heat the fridge up quicker, meaning that your compressor will turn on and off more often. But if you do have too much humidity, then you will need to install a dehumidifier. The dehumidifier will also be controlled on a humidity controller like the SHT2000 or the Inkbird. You will need to set it up opposite to how you set up the dehumidifier. In other words, the dehumidifier will turn on when your high humidity is reached, example 80%, and it'll turn off when your desired lower humidity is hit, example 72%. I've also seen that some people insist installing a fan and or a heating lamp. I must say I'm not a fan of a fan. Simply said, I think fans create too much airflow in this confined space, and this additional airflow could dry out your meats much quicker. Remember, we're trying to emulate the climatic conditions of a subterranean cellar, and there's literally hardly any airflow in a cellar. Obviously, if you have a frost-free fridge or a commercial drinks fridge, they do blow some cool air into the chamber. You need to just make sure that the air doesn't blow directly onto the meat. Most of them do direct the airflow efficiently from the product. In my opinion, opening the fridge door once a day gets rid of the stale air and creates enough circulation, but again, you need to assess your own conditions. I really don't get the logic behind putting in a heat lamp into your chamber. You're able to regulate the temperature well enough with a temperature controller. I've also been told that the reason why a lot of people insert the heating lamp is that they can use the chamber as a fermentation chamber as well for sausages, for dry cured sausages. However, I would never ferment and cure in the same chamber. Besides, my chamber has usually got too much meat in for me to be able to ferment. I mean, if you're going to ferment sausages, I would suggest you create an environment outside of your curing chamber to do that. The other reason why I've heard some people do use a heating lamp is that their curing chamber is an uninsulated garage or building, and their winters do get quite severe. So it might be that the temperatures do drop too much inside the chamber, so that's why they do add a heating lamp. But again, I just personally think there's going to be a conflict or too much of a conflict between the heating lamp and the actual cooling down process, so your compressor is going to be turning on more often. But anyway, you need to assess your situation, and if you find that you do have situations where the temperature is decreasing inside the chamber too much, then you obviously do need to look at this. So I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying don't do it if you don't need it. Okay, so you've set up your new curing chamber and it's got a beautiful glass display window, and you think that's great because people are going to be able to check out your cool meats as they cure. But this is a big no, no, no. And you'll hear me say this probably more than anything. Light is one of your biggest enemies. And the reason why I say that is because light causes the fat in the meat to go rancid. So if you've any kind of display fridge, you're actually going to want to black out the glass. Some display fridges also come with an internal light that is on permanently, and you'll need to actually disconnect that. The normal light that comes in when opening the door is not a problem because you're only going to do it for as long as the door is open. But I will caution you from opening and closing that door too often. I only open my chamber once a day, and I try not to do that for more than 30 seconds to a minute. So when I'm wanting to work in the chamber, I actually do prepare what I want to do before I open the door. Obviously, sometimes, like when you're hanging new meat or whatever, or new sausages, you obviously are going to have to open the door for a bit longer, but obviously try and minimize that as much as possible. My current setup is I have got a chamber with a display fridge, and what I did was I blocked that out using wallpaper that simulates chalkboard or blackboard. So it doubles up because it now allows me to make notes on the actual door itself. So that's great. So I put all my weights and dates and times on there so I can see them as we go. But seriously, I cannot caution you. I actually learned this the hard way. When I still had my shop, the Flying Pig, I had a beautiful display area or a display curing chamber with windows so that people could see the meat curing. And I hadn't realized what the problem was. I just couldn't believe it. My meats were becoming more and more rancid. So really, it was an expensive lesson for me to learn. I just want to quickly touch on obtaining a data logger. Currently, I have an analog hygrometer inside my chamber as a second measure of humidity. This way I can double check my SHT 2000 setup against the analog hygrometer to ensure that everything is set up correctly. But there really is an easier way to do this, and that is by using a data logger. I personally have never used a data logger, but I now have one on order. I think it makes absolute sense to have one of these, and basically how it works is that you have a sensor that you install inside the fridge. It then logs the humidity and the temperature of your chamber for 24/7. This way you're able to ensure that your chamber is literally set up and monitored 100% of the time. How it works is it collects the data through the probe, and via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi it pushes that data directly to your phone. And from reading a lot of the reviews, I understand that the sensor push is probably the best option that you can get, but Inkbird do also make one. Whilst I don't think it's necessary to have one, I think it's a fabulous way to be able to fine-tune your chamber. So if you are building a chamber, really consider getting one. Okay, let's have a quick look at the chamber setup. Okay, so this is the outside part of my chamber. As you can see, I've got the blackboard wallpaper with my notes written on the front, and the temperature and relative humidity controller box. Let's just open it up a little bit, and so you can see inside, very clean and crisp, and you can see the moisture running down the back wall from the evaporator plate. And there's the additional hygrometer that I have, as well as my humidifier. Anyway, take a closer look at the controller box showing the temperature and humidity inside, which is currently reflected at 15.6 degrees centigrade and 58%. You'll notice that there's a little red light to the left of the 58, and that shows that my humidifier is currently on. You'll remember that my low humidity setting is at 72%. Obviously, because I just opened the door, the relative humidity dropped, and I'd also been working inside it a bit before I made the video. So that's the reason why the humidity is low right now. Okay, so I just want to show you the humidifier that's plugged in and is pushed through the door. Also the probe from the controller that also comes in via the door. I've not drilled any holes through the fridge. I just do that through the door. And also just a closer look at the plugs and leads that are coming out of the controller box. To build my controller box, I purchased an electrical box, a plastic box that is actually waterproof, some cable, 3 plugs, 2 wall sockets, some insulation tape, and obviously the tools, and then obviously the SHT2000. This is what the SHT2000 looks like. It's just a small little device. Well, that's basically what it looks like before we close it all up. And then once installed, like I showed you before, that's what it looks like. So here we have the temperature sitting at 11.9 degrees centigrade and the relative humidity is at 74%. By clicking the button, I show you the high and the low temperatures that I've set. The high temperature is 14.5 degrees and the low is 13 degrees. Relative humidity, the low is at 72% and the high is at 72.2%. Back inside, the sponges are just to catch the excess moisture running down the back wall. So behind the chamber I have a container catching any excess water going through the draining hole. Now how it would normally work is that with the evaporator plate, any excess water is drained through the draining hole and that then falls onto the motor of the refrigerator, and the heat of the motor evaporates that water. But we're creating too much water for that, or for the motor to deal with that. So I lead it off into a little container at the back. You can obviously drill a hole through the wall and put a hose through that to make it easier. For me, I just have to clear this out every 2 to 3 weeks. I've also installed these nifty little foot wheels, which makes it easy for me to maneuver my chamber in and out if I need to clean at the back or anything like that without disturbing the meat too much. And then as you can see, the glass part or the glass door has been blacked out, just showing you from the inside. And then closing the door, here's the black chalkboard wallpaper again. And that, ladies and gents, is basically how I've set up my curing chamber. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my YouTube channel.